All right, today we're diving into a really provocative argument that comes from Rashad Khalifa's book, Quran, Hadith, and Islam. He makes a case that, well, it pretty much challenges centuries of Islamic tradition. We're going to unpack his claims piece by piece and really see how he builds his case from the ground up.
So the whole book really boils down to this one pretty startling question. What if two of the most foundational texts in Islam were, as this author puts it, satanic innovations? He's not just saying the Hadith and Sunnah are extra texts. No, he's claiming they're a fundamental corruption of the faith. That is a massive claim, right? So let's dig in and see how he even begins to try and back that up.
Okay, first things first, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with the terms here. The Hadith and Sunnah are essentially collections of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions. For pretty much all of Islamic history, these have been absolutely essential for guiding daily life. So you can see when the author argues against them, he's not just questioning a book, he's questioning the very foundation of mainstream Islamic practice.
So here's our roadmap for breaking this down. We're going to follow his logic step by step. First, we'll look at his startling claim itself, then the Quranic verses he uses to try and support it. After that, we'll see how this thinking changes the Prophet's role, dive into this wild claim about a mathematical miracle, and finally, see what he claims are the disastrous results of ignoring his message.
All right, let's jump right in. Part 1, the startling claim. This is the idea that everything else in his book is built upon.
And here it is, straight from the book's preface. He says his research unveiled a startling fact that the Hadith and Sunnah have nothing to do with the Prophet Muhammad. And he doesn't stop there. He says that to follow them is to commit flagrant disobedience of God. Wow. I mean, that just completely flips the script on the traditional understanding of Islam's holy texts.
So you have to ask yourself, where does an idea this radical even come from? Well, the author claims his entire argument is built on evidence he found right inside the Quran itself. So let's take a look at the verses he uses.
This verse right here is a huge cornerstone of his argument. He puts a ton of emphasis on that phrase, fully detailed. He interprets this to mean that the Quran presents itself as totally complete, perfect, and self-sufficient. It doesn't need any other books for clarification or for laws.
So for him, the logic is really simple. If the Quran is fully detailed, then why on earth would you need other books for religious law? He argues that relying on other texts actually goes against the Quran's own message. This is where he establishes his core principle: one God, one source. He then connects this one source idea to the most fundamental theological principle in Islam, the oneness of God. He brings in verses like this one, which warns believers against setting up partners or, well, other gods beside God.
And here's how he connects those two ideas. The author argues that by elevating texts like the Hadith to the same level as the Quran, you are, in his view, treating them like a partner to God. He frames this as a form of idol worship, which is considered the most serious sin in Islam. It's a really powerful, and for many, a shocking accusation.
So, if you follow this Quran-only framework, it naturally leads to a big question. What then was the Prophet Muhammad's role? If the Quran is the only source, what was his primary job?
In the author's view, the Prophet Muhammad had one job, and one job only: deliver the Quran, period. He points to verses that say the Prophet himself would be punished if he invented any other teachings. This totally reframes Muhammad not as a lawmaker himself, which is the traditional view, but simply as a faithful messenger for God's word.
Now this is where it gets really fascinating. To argue against the Hadith, the author actually uses a Hadith. He points to this report from a major collection where the Prophet himself apparently says to write nothing down except the Quran. For the author, this is the ultimate proof, kind of like a smoking gun. He's saying the tradition contains the seeds of its own undoing.
So the argument then shifts gears pretty dramatically. We're moving away from the theological interpretation and into a claim of tangible, physical proof. This is maybe the most unique part of his entire work: the idea of a complex mathematical code that's supposedly embedded right inside the Quran's text. And at the very heart of this claimed miracle is one number: 19. The author believes this number is a kind of common denominator for an incredibly intricate mathematical structure woven all through the Quran, proving, in his eyes, its divine origin and its perfect preservation.
He starts off by presenting what he calls simple facts. These are kind of the straightforward numerical patterns. For example, the Quran has 114 chapters, which is exactly 19 times 6.
He points out that the very first revelation had 19 words and 76 letters. That's 19 times 4. And the last revelation, also 19 words.
But then the claim goes much, much deeper, into what he calls intricate facts. He focuses on those mysterious initials that you find at the start of 29 chapters. He asserts that if you take one of those letters, say the letter Qaf in chapter 50, and you count every single Qaf in that entire chapter, the total is always a multiple of 19. For him, this interlocking system is just irrefutable proof of divine authorship.
So for the final section of his argument, the author moves from theology and mathematics to history and sociology. He outlines what he sees as the severe, real-world consequences of drifting away from a Quran-only approach. And he presents this very stark, black-and-white view of history. He argues that during the early period when Muslims supposedly upheld the Quran alone, their civilization led the world in science, culture, you name it. But then he claims that the moment they adopted Hadith and Sunnah as other sources, it led to a long period of decline and defeat. It's a really bold cause and effects claim, linking theological purity directly to worldly power. The author calls this verse the Great Criterion, and he presents it almost like a psychological test. He asks, how do you react when you hear God mentioned alone? He argues that if you feel any aversion, it's a sign of disbelief. But if you only feel comfortable when other figures are mentioned alongside him, well, he calls that a sign of idol worship.
And this really brings us to the end of his whole argument. He basically distills his entire thesis down into this one, final, provocative question. It challenges the reader to look inward and examine their own faith. Is your idea of God dependent on other figures, other prophets, or other texts for support? Or can God, as the one and only source of guidance, stand entirely on his own? It's a powerful final thought, and it's definitely designed to leave a lasting impression.